We sometimes live in a time that everyone is afraid to say something, to be canceled or to compromise. Like there's so much. Like come on, y'all. Like she came from she came from like the very beginning of every single thing and was still saying what she had to say at every moment, right? It's like so when I feel afraid to say something or be like my full self, I'm like Toni Morrison said it.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the voice to have.
Books really saved my life.
Hi everyone. This is such a great audience. I'm really happy to be here speaking with Glory and Renee and Jamia. It's such a wonder. So, and thank you for TPL for inviting me to be a moderator. Let's just get into it.
Let's go.
So just to provide some background in case there are people here who don't really know, how did this anthology come to be? And Renee and Jamia, like how did you get involved in it?
Well, first I want to say, is this on? Okay. Thank you, Toronto. This is such an amazing audience. Thank you for welcoming us. It feels good to be here. And Danielle, you did an incredible job. Thank you so much for inviting us. So how did the anthology come to be? It was a lot of prayer, because it really did start off as an Instagram project that transformed. I had this moment where I kept thinking, if Instagram shuts down, like what will I be left with? What will my work or my body of work be? Like how can this live outside of a social media platform? And naturally that's how the festival came to be, but the first thing was I would love to have a collection of all these books, like recommendations, all these conversations that I've been having with people in person to like live in an actual book that we could hold and read. And so it was a dream, and I had a wonderful editor reach out to me. And I had to build the courage to even like say, I could do this, I can actually edit an anthology. But once that was done and I had a proposal together, it really went like fairly quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, and so hi everybody. When Glory invited me to be a part of it, it was an immediate yes. I was like, of course. What was the prompt? Do you remember what?
Yeah, well, it was just, I really wanted everyone to have it to be open. It was just, when did you first see yourself in literature?
And so I knew immediately who I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about Lucille Clifton. That was my first kind of mirror. And I was honored to be a part of it. And it did feel like a conversation. Even I didn't know what the other women were bringing to the table, who they were writing about. So it was such a treat to finally get the book and be like, oh, this person wrote about, and just go through all of that. It was really beautiful. And it feels like a manifestation, a very concrete, practical thing that you can hold when we've been kind of holding each other in a more spiritual way.
Yeah.
The book is a tangible thing.
Hey, y'all. Hey, so I love Glory, and I love Well-Read Black Girl, and when Glory issued this invitation to us, I just felt so honored to be asked to be a part of this community, and like you said, to kind of be in conversation with our peers, people who are well-read Black girls and well-writing Black girls right now, who also wanted to be in conversation with our ancestors. And it was just a really beautiful opportunity. And at the time, my mom, who has now passed away, was really, really sick. And she was the original well-read Black girl in my life. And I think having that invitation was really important for me to be able to write about Nikki Giovanni, who I chose to write about, but also by extension to that love letter to Nikki Giovanni, a love letter to my mother, who in her final days did get to hold your book and read that story and was very much moved by it. So I just knew that it was going to be something that was important for my life.
Yeah, that's super beautiful, and that actually leads beautifully to my next question, because all of you have spoken about conversation and wanting to have a conversation with each other and with other, well-read Black women and with their ancestors. So what conversation, or there's multiple conversations. So what did that look like for you?
Yeah, well, the thing that I found in the book club that was happening was like we were being very vulnerable with one another.
Right.
So and we were talking about, things that were happening at work. There were things that were happening in our everyday lives, whether it was romantic, whether it was how do I get through this like really difficult time? How do I celebrate this thing? And all that like started with the character in the book, but it like bounced off into something that was more organic and really true to who we were. So it felt like we were trying to figure out our interior lives through the characters. And I felt like I wanted that to be the same kind of thread that was in the anthology as well, where it's not oftentimes when you're reading the anthology, it is very academic. It feels like it's really trying to get some point across, whether it's like literary criticism or looking at like craft and process. And I really wanted to have an emotional resonance where this is like really talking about the heart and how you feel and what it's like to discover yourself. And maybe that was the first time you were seeing it and what that emotional attachment was.
Right.
Like I really wanted the essays to feel vulnerable and open and just to have a level of heart to them. And that's why I also didn't give too many instructions, because I wanted it to be whatever your first inclination was, whatever your intuition was telling you to write about. Because I knew what that was for me. Like that was definitely my Angelou. Like I knew that when I read her work, I felt seen. I loved her use of language. I feel like I'm a spontaneous, informal person. Like I don't like things to feel too rigid, and I love how Maya Angelou, like her writing is just her.
Right.
It's just like her. It's 100% herself. Like that's how she talks, that's how she writes, and I wanted that to come across on the page.
So, how did you approach the essays? I guess I'm saying, like, how long did it take for you to write? Was it difficult, or was it kind of did it just come out of you, or?
It wasn't difficult. I mean, I talk often. I write mostly for children. And a lot of times when I'm doing events, young people will ask, like, who do you like and who inspired you to be a writer? So I'm always talking about Lucille Clifton. I feel like I'm bringing her everywhere I go. I've taught her work in the classroom. And so to be able to formally share that story felt really good. And it was easy to write in the sense of I knew who I wanted to write about. But then I had to, I feel like, frame why she's important to me. So I talk about her skin tone, her hair texture, her body, her size. And the first time I read her work and was moved, but when I saw a photo of her, that's when I was like, oh, there are people who look like me who are making work about us. And that was really powerful. I didn't have that necessarily growing up. So to be given us a moment and a space to kind of reflect on that and go back to my reason and like what got me started, what got me believing in myself as a writer, was a powerful gift that Glory gave to me to be able to do that and to honor someone that I love and respect.
Yeah, I felt when we were working on writing it, it was so exciting and yet daunting to think about how do I distill within this word count how much Nikki Giovanni has affected me as a human, as a Black woman, and as a writer. And I really had to give myself a prompt, which I know sometimes as a writer, especially if you're someone who, like myself, I live with anxiety, so I could talk myself into a spin cycle of a lot of things about my writing, like very articulate decimation of self in that point. And I had to say, okay, what I need to do is take control back of this and give myself a prompt. And so the prompt was to bring myself back to high school when I did in fact get to meet Nikki Giovanni at a book signing. And what I wish I had said to her that day versus what I really said, which was, oh my God, I love your work. You were so important to me. I learned so much because of you, you know. And she was very gracious. But I thought, you know, what could I have really said that day if I hadn't been fangirling so hard, and wrote about how she really taught me about my own exploration of home as an African-American expat moving to Saudi Arabia, and what it had meant to have my mother give me a book of poems for her collection that was a children's book of poetry called Spin a Soft Black Song, while my mom had the more adult poems in my house, and these other, and all these other books that were the same size, different illustrations targeted toward her age, and I knew there was language in those poems that were for grown folks, but that I would eventually graduate to that, and that this was the palette tester for me to be able to become a well-read Black woman, right? And so just being in that conversation with her and really putting on paper, Nikki, this is what I wish I could have said to you, was really how I was able to finally get it out.
Yeah, and I think that there is so much of that you're trying to figure out how to pay, like, just honor your ancestors, but those, like, I was also writing to my mother, I was also writing to my younger self, you know? A lot of times people ask, like, why is it called Well-Read Black Girl? Because I am, like, thinking about who I was when I was 13, who I was when I was 6 years old, where I had these yearnings and desires to figure out my identity, and the first thing I would go to was a book, and that book helped me really cultivate and nurture that person inside that wanted to come out.
Yeah. It's interesting. I feel like there were several of us who wrote about our childhood. Like
Yeah.
I start with being, you know, a
But
young.
then you bring it into present day
Right,
too.
yeah, but just thinking about those first books that you receive, or those moments that you can't forget, you can't let go of, that really shape you, whether you're a writer or a reader or whoever we become in life. It's interesting to go back to childhood and look at who were my influences,
Right.
And which people stood out. And so, yeah, I read, like, I love Nikki and Maya, and that was also challenging. It was like, there are so many people like I wanted to write about, knowing okay, I'm gonna do Lucille, and I wanna do her story justice. How do I do that? And how do you bring your full self to the short essay? You know, it was also like, there's a word count, there's a practical stuff of like, I wanna write. And when you're writing about a poet, then you wanna write well too. Like it was all of that fear of like, am I doing her justice by saying she inspired me? Then I also wanna write something that's worthy of her words too. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense.
But I definitely felt the pressure of like, oh my goodness, I hope Glory likes this. She invited me to be a part of it.
I did. I loved
you
it.
just get nervous when you're about to send something out into the world. So there was a lot of emotion, I remember, around writing it and releasing it to the editors and, you know, all of that.
I'm going to go back to that in a while. But you were talking about firsts, and so I have a lot of questions about, like, you know, your first this and your first that. So my first actually starts off with Jamia, because in your essay, you wrote, through her storytelling, I knew that everyday Black children like myself were living lives of both simplicity and courageous complexity across time zones. And that is a beautiful, beautiful passage. I loved it so much. And that made me think about if, for each of you, do you remember the first book you read by a Black woman outside of the US, you know, whether it's in Canada or in the UK or, you know, on the continent or in the Caribbean? And how was that experience? And was it similar or different to reading books by African American women? And so, yeah, I was very curious about what that would be like.
Thank you so much. That just gives me chills, because I think, you know, establishing my identity as a well-read Black girl hasn't always been easy. And I think I write about this in the piece about what society and culture tells you your identity should be in the context of an African American Black girl versus the reality of the complexity and multidimensionality that we all are. And within the context of my larger family, I didn't fit in because I had lived abroad. I might have been raised in a different class bracket than the majority of a lot of people in my family. They thought I talked funny, walked funny, dressed funny. The rock music that I liked was not considered cool, and everyone thought I was a really weird nerd who read too much. And it was, which is true. Now I embrace it. But I think that all of that was really interesting on the other side of it, where I did go to really diverse schools in Saudi Arabia, but I was also one of the few African American students in those schools too, so there was a part of my life and my family life and the things that my Black professor parents would talk about that was just different than what my peers were experiencing. So for me, I felt that I was lucky to be introduced to Black writers outside of the US early, just because I think that was a way that my parents were trying to help me feel seen outside of just Black identity, but more kind of, there's a whole diaspora of Blackness, and Blackness is experienced differently. And so even if you feel like you might be considered outsider in our South Carolina and North Carolina family connection, that here's this book from Jamaica Kincaid. That was the first one that I got. That will show you that there are Black people who might talk differently than the way that we talk at home, but it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. And so I feel really lucky that my parents were very focused on that. And then I think the Black Power movement of the 70s that my parents were very much involved in, kind of them getting into a moment when they changed their names and got into an internationalistic movement and traded their suits for dashikis and then traded them back. That's a whole other essay. That really led me to kind of get the gift of them saying, you know, you are African. Africa is our mother. You need to read these books, right? So I think I feel lucky that I had that, and at the time I almost felt like it was overkill, and now I realize it was such a great gift.
Yeah, so I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and my teachers, which means I grew up in predominantly white schools, and most of my teachers gave us white authors. At home, I read a lot of poetry because of my mother, and I read a lot of Black poets all through elementary school, middle school. I don't remember when I was introduced to Jamaica Kincaid, but I do have memories of her work throughout my life, and especially Girl. That piece, I must have been in high school, I would imagine. And I just remember like sitting up. Like, I'm of Jamaican descent, and hey, but you know, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and there's not a lot of Jamaican people there. And there was just something about that, even though like she was not born in Jamaica, like, but there was just something about that piece that was like, oh, that's my grandmother. Like, I know this in a very intimate way. And so I remember that really, really sticking with me and becoming one of my like all-time favorite pieces of any writer, but especially of her.
Yeah, I think for me, it definitely would be Bessie Head. To Stir the Heart is one of my favorite books, and I am Nigerian. I'm Nigerian American. Both my parents are of Nigerian descent, and I was reading like Chinua Achebe. I was like reading a lot of male authors, but it wasn't until I like encountered Bessie Head in college. It wasn't even like in high school that I was like, okay, this is what an African woman is like writing, you know. And then of course, you know, we're in Toronto. We have to give it up for Dion Brand, you know. Yes. 100%. Her poetry really left an impact on me, and just like, you know, Language is Not Neutral, like just so much of her work was like really embedded in like what I wanted to emulate and what I wanted to understand. And when it came to being a woman in the diaspora, what does it look like to be someone in South Africa, to be Black in Toronto, to be Black outside of the context of Western society? So yeah, those are definitely, and then there's been so many more. I feel like now that's like not even a question I would like second guess because the canon has expanded and there's just like so much more literature out, but it wasn't until Bessie Head that I had an understanding.
So amazing. And it's really funny how the answers are going, because they always lead so wonderfully into like my next question.
Oh, you're just a great moderator.
So yeah, I was actually thinking about Veronica Chambers' essay, Why I Keep Coming Back to Jamaica, because when I read it, I like inwardly squealed because I love Jamaica Kincaid, and she was one of the first authors that I read that was like a Black female author. But although for me it was Annie John, which I like took from my mother's bookshelf, and then Girl, I think I discovered when I was in high school as well. Yeah. So just being able to read another Black woman talk about an author that I really loved as well, and that had that sort of conversation and that sort of intimacy was great. And that got me thinking about when the first time, another first question, you connected with another Black woman over literature, and what was that like, and you know, just kind of how that came to be, especially considering how we've been talking about literature as a gateway to all these other things, like whether you're talking about work or you're talking about your family or you're talking about romance. It's just this sort of intimate type of connection to people.
It's so funny because I brought my best friend with me. She's here in the audience. And And she will tell you, like, I've always been like a bit bookworm, and like now we're both in our, excelling in our careers. And I remember Ida always like drawing cartoons and doing this stuff, and now she's a designer. And and it's like you are the person you are when you're like a young person. It just like grows and and if it's cultivated and loved upon, like you just become your best person. So yeah, I definitely had, and I was, I had book clubs when I was little too, and I had like all these, and I was very much into like scrapbooking. That was like a thing that I was very obsessed with. Oh my God, I was very nerdy. But I'm trying to think when the first time I always shared those experiences with my best friend, but we didn't necessarily call it a thing. Like we were just kind of like reading books together or like drawing cartoons together. And so there was this natural intimacy. And, like I've known her since the 6th grade, and now we're in our 30s. So it's just like, it just was a thing. So I don't think I don't have like this one moment where I was like, oh, I shared this like special book with Ida. It was just like something we just did together. It was very organic. But then if I really think about it, I went to Howard University, and that was such a formative experience for my identity and understanding of the duality of just being of Nigerian descent and being American. And so I had some really incredible moments at Howard where like just having debates and conversations about Black literature and what it meant for, when you're in college, you're just like, you really think you're doing something. Like you are, but you're like really, it feels intense. It feels like life and death when you're debating. You're just like, yes, and this is gonna happen. We're gonna protest. We're gonna do all. You're passionate, And everyone's like, calm down. Like it's freshman 101. Don't take yourself so seriously. But it felt good to just be, to like debate with other Black women and have like a very sharp opinion on literature and know that it felt like valued and important, even if it was sometimes a little like ludicrous, but it was so important to have this conversation. So Howard definitely was a space for me where I learned that and had that kinship.
I've been thinking, so performance writing and reading have always been in relationship with each other for me. Like I'm reading, and then I get inspired to write something, and what I write, I share. And so in high school, and I think that started in high school. So I'm thinking back to my theater class where my teacher, there were a lot of Black girls in this class, and our teacher would give us poems, and we would perform them as monologues. And so we were, Maya Angelou, phenomenal woman, having to memorize that and stand up in front of your peers and perform that on a stage. Still I Rise, Langston Hughes poems, all kind of poetry. And we would, we have to read it and then talk about, okay, how are you gonna say this stanza? And then I'm gonna say, and then I'm gonna step forward. So it was like, we were so into reading it, discussing it, and then figuring out how to share that work. And then we would write our own poems. So sometimes we'd do these little shows, like little tiny one acts. And we'd each have our monologues and that were influenced or inspired by the text that he had given us. And those were like my first days of really being vulnerable. Like I used to write all the time. I've always been a writer, but it was very private. I didn't want to share it. I was way too shy to get on stage and read anything. But high school, I kind of started coming out of my shell because of those girls. And we're still in contact with each other. Like we're still friends and keep up with what's happening in each other's lives. So yeah, those were tender and special moments for sure.
I wish we could have hung out when we were younger. I just keep thinking, it would have been so great if we had had a book club then too. But I feel like it was really about my family being really into literature and it being a part of our identity. First it was religion, and then family, and then education and intellectualism. Those things were, and then activism. And those things were very much valued in my home, and my parents were professors, and my grandmother, it had been really important to her to ensure that her kids on my mom's side all got PhDs, which she was successful in that. And I think a big part of that came from the fact that she had gone to Tuskegee Institute and studied under George Washington Carver at the end of his tenure, and had been the first one in her family to go to college, and really seeing that.
With all the stories.
Yeah, I got the opportunity to write both her obituary and my mom's, and everyone keeps being like, you need to write this.
Yes.
I made them very feminist obituaries, and she really pushed education. So my mom was named after Willa Cather, because my grandmother really liked her
You
books.
gotta tell people. Not everybody knows.
And so I think, and I'm gonna, you're on me about the book. I need to have you talk to me and my agent, because I'm behind on a deadline. But I really think it was baked in. I can't think of an early moment. I think it was always kind of like, what are you reading? And I think people in this room who have Black parents know, like, they'd be like, why is there not a book in your hand? Like, in a really intense, insistent way, right? Like, it wasn't just, and I think that was a sign of love, but it'd be like, oh, you're sitting here idle? Like,
go read a book.
Like, go read a book, go clean something, go get me the remote control, right? So I think that was also a big part of it.
That's real.
I felt like, oh, if I'm gonna be here, like, eating these people's food and they're gonna give me shelter, then I have to, do these things that I have the privilege to do. Because it was always told to me too, well, our ancestors had to fight for this right. This right to read, to get this education. Reading is so powerful, they didn't want us to do it. Like, that's why you need to know this. That's why you need to study. And so I think it was really that. And then when you talked about being taken seriously, when my parents took me seriously enough to send me to writing camp when I was about 9 years old, that's what really showed me that they believed in me, that my writing was something that was important, that my voice was important. And I wish that every child had that.
It's interesting, talking about, so my mother was that same, like, if I said I'm bored, oh, what? You're not bored, there's a whole bookshelf. And even if it was the Bible, like, I would see my mother reading her Bible. There was just somebody in the house was always reading. And we had to discuss what we read. There was no such thing as, like,
book reports.
you read a book and then you don't tell me about it.
Right,
It's like,
right.
well, what was it about? What did you learn?
Yes.
What are you, we always had to discuss it too. And I think that both of those things, the reading of it, but also, like, having to have a discussion of what are these words doing to you?
Right,
What
it's
do
like the
they
beginning
mean?
of, like, analysis.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think? Like, how did it make you
Yeah.
feel? My mother was the same way, very much like, I want to know what you think about this book. Like, it's not just about reading it, but, like, analyze it with me, like, tell me your response to it. It was just like a deeper connection.
So I'm gonna go off script for a bit, just because we're all having, like, this sort of communal, like, oh my God, my mother did that too, because my mom made me write book reports, and it was sort of the same thing where I'd be like, I'm bored, and she's like, well, there's books right there. So, like, so I just want to talk a little bit about, like, the influence that parents and, like, mothers have on your reading, and, like, like, I guess just talk about that a little bit more.
Well, one thing at the time, I was probably very frustrated as a teenager, as a young person.
Same.
But, like, this idea of, like, your opinion matters. Like, I always felt, like, even when my mom and I would kind of go back and forth with things, like, she always made me feel like it matters what you say, how you say it, like, how you interpret ideas. Like, we would watch news together. We'd watch, like, Jeopardy. Like, that was like our, Jeopardy.
Same.
Like, and she would be like, do you know that answer? Like, like, keep going. Like, so this idea that, like, whatever. And also when I was wrong, it was okay too. Like, there were plenty of times I had these outrageous ideas, and my mom would be like, okay, like, let's write that down. Let's, like, look up the right answer. Like, let's, like, we had an encyclopedia. Like, let's actually figure out what the real reasoning is. Like, it doesn't always have to be necessarily your opinion. Like, let's have it fact-based and, like, do research. So that I really enjoyed that part of our relationship. Like, let's look it up together. Let's understand it. Let's, like, talk about this, whatever you're thinking or whatever your ideas are. And so I never felt, like, shut down by that. And it allowed me to go. So my brother is an engineer, and my other brother is an educator. And so when I wanted to go into, like, journalism and creative writing, actually I really wanted to do, like, creative writing from the beginning, but my mom was like, you will do journalism because I feel like you can get a job with that. But, like, this would still allow you to be, like, your creative self. But she never, like, the tradition with the most if there's Nigerians in the room, it's like you become a doctor, you become a lawyer, you know, like that's it. You know, maybe a registered nurse, like, you know, and my mom wasn't that way. Like before she came to the United States, she was a historian, she studied history, and then when she came here because of circumstances, she did become a registered nurse. But she was like, you really can do whatever you want to do as long as you can pay your bills. And I have like, now that I have a book, she's like, you can pay your bills, which is not all the way true, but yes. You know, I'm a little more stable than before, but like it was this wonderful gift of like, I believe that you can do anything you want and you don't have to be, like you don't have to have a conventional life, you don't have to have a conventional career as long as you're willing to explore and ask questions. And that was just like such a blessing for my mother because I've done so many different things in my career, in my life. I had so many things I explored and I feel like I have a very full life because of it. And my mom was the first person to give me permission to do that.
Yeah, I think about 7, 8, 9 years old, my family was economically poor, and I stress economically, right?
Yeah.
We were rich and wealthy in so many other ways.
Yeah, talk about that.
But for holidays or friends' birthdays who were outside of my immediate family, I didn't have money to buy them gifts. So my mother was like, well, you're a good writer, write them a poem. And I was like,
so sweet.
no. But I would. So I started writing poems as gifts to people. And I was so embarrassed. I'd write the poem, give it to the person, and kind of just run off. Like I did not want to stay to see their reaction, and they'd come back to me time and time again and say, your words moved me.
Wow.
I cried when I read it. I'm saving it. I'm going to frame this. And I was just like, what? My words have power? My words move people? And that just did something for me as a kid. I was very young when I learned that reading and writing, that there was something powerful about that. And my mother, would listen to every story I wrote. Yeah. Like I would come to her, she's cooking or washing the dish. I'm sitting on the floor in the kitchen with my little journal, reading her, I'm sure not good story. I mean, just murder mysteries and all kind of poems that rhymed and had good rhymes. But she was like, I love this part and I want to know more about this. She just listened.
Yeah.
And I felt seen. And my mother was busy.
Yeah.
I'm one of 5. Like she was managing a whole lot of stuff, but somehow she still made me feel like my voice mattered and that what I had to say and share was worthy of her time, even though she didn't have a lot of time.
Right.
And I really think that is why I'm a writer today. I mean, there's all these other reasons and mentors and teachers, but when it really goes down to it, it is my mother took the time to listen to me.
Yeah.
And that was a powerful gift that she gave me for sure.
Yes.
I think it's such a lesson for all of us in terms of thinking about the next generation and how we take seriously their interests and their desires and also the representation they see in terms of people who do have artistic careers and live off of them, right? Because there's this myth that you can't, where, kids are internalizing this idea that, oh, well, this thing that I'm passionate about or I'm good at, I can't do. And when there's a reality that there are many of us living out in the world, living our dreams. My husband's a jazz musician, and often people will say to us, thank you. A lot of people will say, oh, how do you all eat? And I'll be like, clearly, somehow we get by, we're still here. And obviously, my student loans people may differ with that, but I think that it's really important to also let kids know that you can have a full life doing the things that you feel are your unique contribution, tapping into your strengths. And I think that for me, both of my parents always encouraged it, and my dad was always a feminist. He always encouraged me, said there's nothing that I couldn't do if I didn't put my mind to it. And I think my mother saving the first book that I'd ever written, I put it in quotes, and handing it to me the first time I had a book was really important to me, that it was some stapled pages that I'd tied together with ribbons, and like you said, there were spaceships and black mermaids and all sorts of other things that were going on in this. But the fact that she saved that for a moment to say, and she said, you've contributed to a lot of different things. I was doing a lot of writing on the internet for a while and everything, and she said when I had my first book that was mine, that she wanted to hand it to me to say, I always believed in you. I always knew that you would grow up to do this. And I just think that if you have kids now, to really think about saving those things, because I can't tell you what a support they are for me when I find myself having writing blocks, seeing that and remembering, oh, she's always believed in me before there was any recognition, before there were any of the markers of what it means to be a writer, you know? But she always knew that this was a part of what I needed for my soul.
I think educators play a role too, as mothering and ushering in and nurturing dreams and being gatekeepers, librarians or gatekeepers who are giving books to young people. And all of that really, really matters to say to a child, you are an artist right now. You are a singer. You are a dancer. You might not be a professional dancer. You might not be a published writer, but you're a writer. You write. And to keep nurturing that is so important. So even if it's not happening at home, those of us who have young people in our lives, auntie, you know, you're a mentor, you teach. I think it's important to think about how are you fanning the flame for young people so that they can grow up and be who they're called to be.
It's so interesting because my mom also saved my first book, and it was, you know, the movie Land Before Time?
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, it was like me and my cousins like going on an adventure with all of the different dinosaurs of Land Before Time.
That's amazing.
So yeah, just, you know, speaking about like, you know, this for the next generation and shepherding and all these different kinds of things. I can't let this conversation go by without mentioning Toni Morrison. And so, you know, Toni Morrison.
We can clap for that.
We can clap for Toni Morrison. And you know, just in the anthology and just, you know, speaking to writers, speaking to Black women, Toni Morrison is you know, always on our tongue. So I just wanted to hear more about what Toni Morrison meant for each of you and, you know, what she did for you as women, Black women, as writers and, you know, readers.
I mean, without question, like Toni Morrison set the precedent. She set the precedent for every single Black woman writer, for every writer, let's keep it plain. And her loss was felt deeply. And I think that people are still meeting her on the page. They're discovering themselves in her work, and just trying to figure out like, what do we do next? I feel like this feeling of like, how can I continue to pay tribute to her and honor her and make sure that her work will never be forgotten, you know? I actually want to go through my book and like count how many times Morrison is mentioned, because every single writer had a note or had some kind of level of just like, what does Morrison mean and how does she influence my craft, my writing, just my whole being. And I remember the first time I read The Bluest Eye and Sula, and my favorite book by Morrison is Jazz. I love jazz so much. It's just like, it's one of my all-time favorites. But there are so many times, because I read it fairly young, like I was in maybe the 8th grade when I picked up Beloved, and I just didn't understand. You know, it's actually this like lack of understanding or full comprehension that brings me back to Morrison, because you learn something new with every reading, and it just kind of opens you up. And then when I decided to really become an editor and pursue that in a way that I really wanted to be diligent, like I was thinking of Morrison at Random House and the work she did with Angela Davis and Muhammad Ali and so many authors, you know? And so she just really, I mean, I honestly, I listen to Morrison every day because I do a lot of audiobooks and I fly a lot. And so I will just like put on Sula or Song of Solomon and like listen to her voice just because it just feels comforting, you know? I think she just has left an impression on every Black woman.
Yeah, it was such a loss, like that I felt. I remember I sent you a text message, just like I wanted to reach out to my people and be like, "Are you okay?" Or do you want to come over? Like, what should we do? I felt like we needed to mourn together. When I think about her impact on my life, I mean, of course, her books, yes, but her is as a person. Her being like, I am a Black woman. I'm not apologizing for that. I'm not making any.
No compromises.
All of that. I think of her interviews with white interviewers where she had to like check them.
Right.
I think of her speech for the Nobel Prize
yeah.
and a lot of her essays and like, you know, these short articles sometimes that she would write, that really resonates with me. Like how are we outside of our craft of writing?
Right.
Like how are we at living?
Yeah,
and
how
I
are we
feel like
showing-
she
yeah.
was just, she showed up in a way in this life that was just powerful to watch. And I learned so much about how to advocate for yourself.
Yeah.
How to advocate for your work, how not to apologize for your work, like the whole white gaze and just all of that. I learned so much about just who to be as a person because of her existence. Yeah, so her books I love for sure, but I just, when I'm thinking about the loss, I'm like, I want her to write an op-ed. I'm missing those like moments where she would just come out and be like, yeah, I still got it.
Well,
and
you
I got
know
something to say about that, you know.
But the thing about her also is like that we sometimes live in a time that everyone is afraid to say something, to be canceled or to
Yeah.
compromise. Like there's so much, like come on, y'all. Like she came from she came from like the very beginning of every single thing and was still saying what she had to say at every moment, right? It's like, so when I feel afraid to say something or be like my full self, I'm like, Toni Morrison said it. You know what I mean? And like, was it, like, and she's always from the beginning. Like I started reading some of her essays when she was at Howard, when she was just like a young person. Like that consistency of person and who she was never wavered. You know, so when I feel afraid to say something, I'm like, no, like, you have to just be yourself and tell the truth. And really have like true integrity and not compromise for anyone else because everything else will be swirling and changing around you, but you have to be who you are, you know? And success, if you have quality, like success will come. Like if you're doing the hard work and it's true and it's like authentic, like success will come, but you can't change for other people. And that's what she did not change ever.
No. Yeah.
She really knew who she was, and I love that. I mean, I feel too just watching, so the Feminist Press, we took a team outing to go see the documentary about Toni Morrison because we thought, okay, how are we going to pay homage to this woman who has shaped literature, who hasn't gotten the kind of recognition that she truly deserves as one of the major players in the canon. Like if we were to correct the canon, she would, but we need to honor her and stop everything and take time out of our day and go learn about her life. And I think not a dry eye was in that theater when we went as a team, but I think a big part of it was that she also just lived her life so unapologetically, so authentically, and with such a regal dignity that I also really draw from that she wrote about everyday Black women and very much showed and kind of reclaimed the value that is diminished because of culture, because of systemic oppression and all of those things in the cultural conversation, and says, oh, this is actually who we are. And I think that's something that was really important about her. I also feel like there's so much about history that I learned about her, that although she wasn't a scholar in terms of the PhD sense, I include her as a thought leader and someone who was very much a historian, that the Margaret Garner story was surfaced to the forefront of the conversation. Operas were made about it, et cetera, because Toni surfaced that story. So I think we all owe her great debt. And I also think that one of the great sadnesses I have is that there were many books in my home that I read that were amazing books that I didn't know were edited by her. And so there's a conversation about publishing and industry that we all play different parts in, right? That there's major issues around diversity and disparity across the board. And what did it mean that she was this elder, a Black woman in publishing, for which we are unicorns, in executive positions? It can count on two hands how many Black women have directorships at publishers around the world. And that Toni was at a top house in the Big Five and editing some of the highest yielding books of that time, and that many people don't know that part of the story. So I think it's a part of our story now to make sure that we're continuing to uplift that too.
100%. And then also the sisterhood factor. There's a beautiful scene in the documentary where Sonia Sanchez is talking about the bluest eye at one point, and it wasn't like it hadn't hit the bestseller list yet, and she ended up ordering like 30,000 copies to teach.
Yeah,
you
I
know,
remember
and
that.
that like is what, you know, pushed the threshold to keep it relevant and making other educators read it. You know, the point when she was nominated for the Pulitzer, the letter that Alice Walker and June Jordan and all these women came together to say, she's being neglected by these prize committees, we're gonna put an op-ed in the New York Times, and that's what led to her like winning the Pulitzer and Nobel, like all these things where the fact that she finished Toni Kincaid-Bambara's book when she passed away, you know, I mean, like the sister, the love that they have for one another is what really serves as a community model for me, because it's like this generosity, this love for we have one another, we can be in collaboration and support one another. We don't need to be in competition, right? Like, because we actually go further and stronger when we're together, you know? And she did that, and maybe she didn't, you know, she wasn't doing it on Instagram, like, but she was doing it in a way that was true to her and authentic, and really supported and uplifted other Black women. And that is like, that's another part of the story that needs to be told, you know? Like, she was a sister friend to so many people. Yeah, and yes, yeah. I mean, I can say so much about Toni Morrison. It's just like can go on and on. How did she affect you?
Oh man, I don't know if I can even like, if I can even think about the words. But it's funny you mentioned how you read or you tried to read Beloved in the 8th grade. I always say that I grew up reading Toni Morrison because, again, it was on my mother's bookshelf, and I would take it out and I would try to read it, and I thought I would understand it, but I didn't really quite. And so every couple years I would return to it because there was something, I had a spiritual connection to that work that I didn't quite know, but yeah, like I grew up reading it and just trying to understand it, and then, you know, that led to The Bluest Eye, and that led to Sula, and that led to jazz, which I love, and yeah, and then I remember there was like a phase in high school where I'm like, I'm gonna be the next Toni Morrison, I'm gonna be Toni Morrison, but nobody can be Toni Morrison.
Right, exactly.
And then it became this idea when I was older that I just wanted to have the same. When I wrote, I wanted to at least inspire the same emotion Toni Morrison inspired in me into one other reader at least. Then I would be like, okay, then I've made it if I can do that.
Well, you have. I read your book.
Oh,
Yes, girl. There were so many scenes. I just love the first page of the book, The Pig's Head.
Thank you.
I was saying that earlier because I'm just like, there's so many scenes where I'm just like, this is so real. Like, you really capture the just like being first generation and having like foreign parents and like what that's like. Like where you're just like, oh man, we are living two different worlds, but I love you.
Thank you. Gonna make me cry.
How do you say plantain? Plantain.
Plantain.
Okay. All right.
They know. They were like, hey.
You're gonna start a war. You're gonna start something.
Great. I'm like, I didn't say it up here. Okay, just making sure. My bad. Right.
Oh, see, like you're starting like all these other things.
I love it.
So, Renee.
After that.
On that note. So you've spoken in other interviews, you know, the importance of representation in literature, but also in like, you know, literature for youth, and which is why you like to write books for young adults. And you referenced a quote by Rudine Sims Bishop that children need both mirror and window books, books where they can see themselves in the pages, books that open up a new world to them. And that actually reminded me of, you know, what you were discussing in terms of well-read Black girl and redefining what it means to be well-read. So I question, and I think the reason why I paired the two together is because, you know, you kind of create that discussion of what it means to be well-read when you're younger, as you're sort of talking about. So I guess my question for all of you is, what do you think being well-read means now, and or in general, like in the general consciousness, and what would you want to change that to? Do you want to change that? Like, you know, what's that sort of conversation?
I mean, that's a great thing. I think the idea of being well-read, for me, is very simple. It's like that opening up a book, being inquisitive, being curious, wanting to learn more about yourself and others, reading for context, for nuance. And it's been really surprising. Sometimes I do get responses where the feedback can feel very elitist. And I grew up in a very working class family. Again, both my parents are immigrants. Like, we definitely have this feeling of like we are working together, and I never want there to be a barrier to to literature or anything else. And so this idea of being well-read is just being an openness, being curious, like going after things, and being in a public library. That's like I spent much of my childhood at the public library because it was / like a babysitter. You know? In the summertime, yes, me and my brother stayed at the library writing our book reports, and it was like just like a wonderful resource, and I learned so much about myself and about my community, right? So like this idea that the library invested in me, and my mother invested in me, and education was important. So being well-read is that fire of just like being curious and growing as a person. And I think as the community has grown, and I feel like this immense responsibility that I don't want there to be any barriers of entry. Like, I just really want you to be excited. And in the anthology, I was so intentional about putting all those reading lists in there. Like, I was just like, okay, there's no excuse for you not to know a Black woman playwright, a Black woman science fiction writer, you know, YA authors. Like, I wanted it to be like a keepsake of all these things that an educator, a mother, anyone could pick up this book and know where to begin. And if you didn't have the opportunity to read that as a child, you have it now. And then you can share that with others. And that's how I define it. And I think it's like keeping things as simple as possible and allow people to add their own interpretations and build upon it. Is the best way to do things, because like, who am I to define what it is to be well-read, right? Like, I'm not gonna trademark that. Actually, I have well-read Black girl. I have trademarked well-read Black girl. But this idea of like being like, I don't own the words like well-read, right? like that is something that we all have access and like opportunity to grow and nurture.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to what you said. I think, yes. I mean, I think in my mind, being well-read is a person who is reading, like thinking about, like this idea that people will brag about, oh, I don't read. Right. Well, that's a problem.
Right.
That's actually not something you should be proud about. I have a lot of people who say that to me, and I just like, I don't even know how to respond to that. So I think it's yeah, like that you're reading diversely, like that you're thinking about, okay, maybe I love this one genre, but I'm also going to try this. I think that's what's great about the book club, is that there's so many different books and types of writers that you're exposing people to if they don't know, because we kind of stay in our lane. I write realistic fiction. That's what I mostly read, and then poetry. But I've learned about other writers because of your list, and so that's what I think about too, is being well-read, as being like well-versed and having something to say, like, this is what I'm reading right now. And not just like, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know a book that's been out in the last year. Like, you should be able, hopefully, to name a book or two that you have enjoyed lately. I think that's important. I'm talking about adults, not just young people, but adults.
And Jamia, before we go to the audience?
I think it's about an insatiable love of reading, you know, that can't necessarily be measured. Everyone has their different thing, but the well-read people I want to be around would be the people who understand the importance of reading. I also feel as if a person says they don't read, and people say this to me too, and I want to say, don't you realize I'm a writer and a publisher, right? What? But when people say that often, I often like to say this because I'm totally fine with, you know, awkwardness, and I'll say, wow, you know, the president we have now is connected to the fact that we have a lower number of readers than we might have had back in the past, and if we could make America read again, then maybe we wouldn't be where we are. So I'm sure that he doesn't read anything except his bank balances, but I think that for me, reading is important, because if you don't read, it means that you feel that you have all the answers. And I'm interested in people who are looking and living into the questions.
Yes. And I would add to that we are, by doing this, by being like collectively reading together, having discussions, we are like shifting the canon. We are like redesigning what is important, what is read, what is valued, what is critiqued, you know, and that is so important. So we can have this canon that isn't just focused on, you know, white men, and it opens up to a world of amazing writers that deserve to be acknowledged and recognized in every facet.